Old Hollywood loved to sell us perfect marriages, glossy magazine covers, diamond rings, and smiles big enough to hide the truth. Behind those photographs, the real stories were full of betrayal, silence, and impossible choices. The studio system didn't just control careers, it controlled love stories. Marriage was part of the contract, another performance for the public. When husbands strayed, wives faced a brutal calculation: stay and smile or walk away and lose everything. Their careers, their children, their reputations, sometimes their sanity. The cameras never stopped rolling. The gossip columnists never stopped watching. And the wives? They learned to hold their heads high while their hearts broke in private. Some stayed out of love, believing marriage was worth the fight. Others stayed because divorce meant scandal, and scandal meant the end. Still others stayed because walking away simply wasn't an option in an era when women had fewer choices and Hollywood had all the power. These weren't weak women. They were survivors who understood that strength sometimes looks like staying. They rewrote the rules of loyalty on their own terms, turning private heartbreak into quiet dignity. Their stories reveal the hidden cost of fame, the price of keeping up appearances, and the complicated truth that staying isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's the hardest choice of all. From silent-era sweethearts to golden-age goddesses, here are 10 old Hollywood wives who stayed after their husbands cheated and changed the story of what it meant to be strong. Joanne Woodward and Paul Newman, the myth versus the marriage. She was the woman who made Paul Newman stay home. That's how Hollywood told it anyway. The golden couple. Newman's blue eyes and Woodward's quiet intelligence. 50 years of marriage in an industry where 5 years is a miracle. They built a life on philanthropy, salad dressing, and what looked like perfect love. But perfection is always a lie. Newman's posthumous memoir and the documentary The Last Movie Stars pulled back the curtain. The marriage wasn't easy. There were challenges, rumors that followed them through decades of fame. Biographers whispered about complexities, moments when the fairy tale cracked. But they stayed, through the gossip, through the pressure, through the long stretches when Hollywood marriages were falling apart all around them. Why did Joanne stay? Because she saw past the movie star to the man. Because they shared more than a bed. They shared a mission, a family, 6 daughters between them, and a partnership that mattered more than perfection. She didn't stay because she was naive. She stayed because she chose the hard work of real love over the easy escape of walking away. Newman once said the secret to their marriage was that he couldn't find anyone better. But the truth was simpler. Joanne Woodward knew that staying was the most radical act in Hollywood. She turned old Hollywood scandals into a testament to endurance, proving that celebrity marriages could survive if both people refused to quit. The tabloids wanted her to be a victim. She refused to play the part. In a city built on illusion, she made loyalty look real. Veronica, Rocky Cooper, and Gary Cooper, staying through the storm. She left him once. That's the part people forget. Rocky Cooper wasn't a doormat. When Gary Cooper's affair with Ingrid Bergman became too public to ignore, when the studio cover-up couldn't hold, Rocky walked away. A legal separation in 1951. The golden couple of classic Hollywood marriages, split apart by betrayal and tabloid storm. The press loved it. America's hero, the cowboy with the conscience, caught in an old Hollywood affair with one of cinema's most beautiful women. But it didn't end there. Patricia Neal came next. Another co-star, another round of whispered rumors. Gary Cooper couldn't seem to stop breaking the vows he'd made in 1933. Rocky could have divorced him. She had grounds. She had public sympathy. But after 2 years of separation, something shifted. Maybe it was their daughter. Maybe it was their shared history. 20 years of building a life together. Maybe it was faith. Rocky was deeply Catholic. And divorce wasn't just a personal choice. It was a spiritual one. In 1953, she welcomed him home. Not with fanfare, but with quiet determination. They rebuilt. When Gary fell ill years later, she was there. When he died in 1961, she was holding his hand. Why she stayed became less interesting than how she stayed, with dignity, with boundaries, with the understanding that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. She chose family stability over headlines, showed the world that Hollywood loyalty could be real, even after heartbreak. Rocky Cooper didn't save her marriage by pretending nothing happened. She saved it by deciding that love, even wounded love, was worth the work. Dolores Hope and B.O.B. Hope, choosing the long view. 69 years. That's how long Dolores Hope wore the ring. Bob Hope was America's comedian, the man who entertained troops and presidents, who made the whole country laugh. But biographer Richard Zoglin laid it bare in his 2014 book. Bob Hope had numerous affairs over the decades. The rumors weren't rumors. They were facts, quietly managed, carefully buried, part of the price Dolores paid for being Mrs. Bob Hope. She knew. Of course she knew. You don't stay married to a man for nearly 7 decades without knowing exactly who he is. But Dolores made a calculation that modern audiences struggle to understand. She looked at her life, the charity work, the family, the empire they'd built together, and decided it was enough. This wasn't about love conquering all. This was about survival on her own terms. Dolores ran the house, raised their children, managed his image while he managed his fame. She found power in discretion, strength in the long view. While Bob performed for millions, she performed the harder role, the wife who stayed. Her faith kept her anchored. Her commitment to their shared public life gave her purpose. She didn't just endure celebrity heartbreak, she weaponized it, turning her loyalty into a kind of armor that made her untouchable. When Bob Hope died in 2003, Dolores emerged as the keeper of his legacy, the woman who'd outlasted every rumor, every affair, every moment of private pain. She'd chosen the long game and golden age secrets, and in the end, she won. The world called her devoted. She called it survival. Anne Buydens and Kirk Douglas, terms of survival. And Douglas didn't just stay. She negotiated. When she married Kirk Douglas in 1954, she knew exactly what she was getting. A movie star with an ego as big as his talent and a wandering eye that matched his appetite for life. And wasn't naive. She was French, practical, and smarter than the Hollywood game. Kirk's infidelities weren't a secret. He admitted them in interviews, in memoirs, in the couple's own book of letters. But in set terms, she established boundaries. She carved out her own life, her own projects, her own power inside a marriage that could have swallowed her whole. This was European pragmatism meeting American celebrity culture, and understood that perfect fidelity might be a fairy tale, but respect wasn't. She demanded to be treated as an equal partner, not just a trophy wife, and somehow, impossibly, it worked. They stayed married for 66 years, renewed their vows in 2004, built a life around family, philanthropy, and a private understanding that the rest of the world wasn't invited to judge, and wrote about Hollywood power couples with brutal honesty, admitting that staying required accepting certain realities. She didn't stay because she was weak. She stayed because she was strong enough to rewrite the rules. Kirk was famous, but Anne was the one who controlled the narrative of their marriage. She turned old Hollywood affairs into footnotes, made loyalty a choice rather than a prison. When Kirk died in 2020 at 103 and had outlasted every scandal, every headline, every woman who'd briefly caught his eye, she'd won by refusing to play the victim. In a town built on illusion, she'd built something real, messy, complicated, but undeniably hers. Janet Leigh and Tony Curtis, America's sweetheart, learns to smile. She was Psycho's perfect victim on screen. In real life, the knife came from her own husband. Janet Leigh and Tony Curtis looked like Hollywood royalty. Beautiful, talented, madly in love, or so the studio publicity said. They married in 1951 and had 2 daughters, including Jamie Lee Curtis. The magazine sold them as golden age sweethearts, proof that celebrity marriages could sparkle forever. But Tony Curtis couldn't stay faithful. He admitted it in interviews, in his memoir, confessed to affairs that happened while Janet was home with their children. The cruelest blow came when he fell for teenage co-star Christine Kaufman during Terra's Bulba. The press had a field day. America's sweetheart, publicly humiliated. Janet stayed for years. She smiled for the cameras, raised Kelly and Jamie Lee, tried to hold a family together through force of will and Hollywood grace. She stayed because she loved him, because divorce meant scandal, because she hoped he'd change. She stayed because that's what good wives did in 1950s Hollywood. They endured, but there's strength in knowing when to leave, too. In 1962, Janet Leigh chose herself. The divorce was quiet, dignified, final. She didn't trash him in the press. She didn't play the victim. She simply walked away and rebuilt her life on her own terms. Years later, she'd speak about the marriage with sadness, but not bitterness. She'd raised 2 daughters who became stars in their own right. She'd survived Hollywood heartbreak and carved out a legacy that belonged only to her. Janet Leigh stayed until staying cost more than leaving, and then she left with her head high and her dignity intact, the final revenge. Patricia Neal and Roald Dahl, loyalty after betrayal. She couldn't survive the affair. Patricia Neal's marriage to Roald Dahl was never easy. He was brilliant, demanding, sometimes cruel. But she loved him. Through the death of their daughter, through her own devastating stroke and years of painful recovery, through all the tragedies that would have destroyed a weaker couple, she stayed. Dahl was her champion during her recovery, pushing her through grueling rehabilitation, refusing to let her give up. The world saw devotion. What they didn't see was Felicity Crossland, the family friend who became much more. The affair lasted years. Patricia learned about it slowly, painfully, the way these things are always revealed. A whisper here, a strange absence there, until the truth becomes impossible to ignore. She stayed anyway, for the children, for the shared history, for the hope that the man who'd fought so hard to save her life wouldn't throw their marriage away. But hope has limits. In 1983, 30 years after saying "I do," Patricia Neal finally said enough. The divorce was quiet, exhausted, the end of a love story that had survived everything except betrayal. Years later, Patricia would say she regretted nothing. She'd chosen family first, chosen loyalty over pride, chosen to believe in redemption until believing became impossible. In a life marked by untold Hollywood love stories and unthinkable tragedy, she'd shown that staying isn't always the ending. Sometimes it's just the middle, and walking away is its own kind of bravery. The tabloids called it failure. She called it finally choosing herself. Alma Reville and Alfred Hitchcock, the quiet partner. She was his first audience, his toughest critic, his secret weapon. Alma Reville wasn't just Mrs. Hitchcock, she was half the genius. They married in 1926, two film professionals who understood the game. Alma was an editor, a writer, a creative force who shaped every Hitchcock masterpiece from the shadows. While Alfred became the master of suspense, Alma became the master of keeping everything together, the work, the family, the carefully constructed image. But Alfred had obsessions. The blonde actresses who haunted his films haunted his life too. Tippi Hedren later spoke about his inappropriate fixations, the way he tried to control her on and off set. Scholars and reporters documented his pattern of becoming consumed by his leading ladies, transferring desire from screen to reality in ways that blurred every professional line. Alma knew. How could she not? She was there for all of it, watching her husband pour his romantic obsessions into film after film while she sat in the editing room, making his vision work. She stayed through the difficult fixations, through the rumors of studio pressure and inappropriate behavior, through decades of being the one who understood him best and saw him most clearly. Why? Because their partnership transcended traditional marriage. They shared creative authorship, a daughter, a lifetime of work that changed cinema. Alma protected that work and the family with fierce pragmatism. She didn't need Alfred to be perfect. She needed him to be brilliant. And he was. When he died in 1980, Alma emerged as the true keeper of his legacy, the woman whose contributions were finally being recognized. She'd stayed not out of weakness, but out of power, the power to shape art, control narrative, and prove that Hollywood loyalty takes many forms. She wrote their own rules, and she kept every promise that mattered. Annabella and Tyrone Power, the wife who waited, then let go. She tried. God knows she tried. Annabella was a French star in her own right when she married Tyrone Power in 1939. He was Hollywood's most beautiful man, and their wedding was the stuff of studio dreams. But then came World War II, and Power enlisted. Distance, danger, and the weight of separation began to crack what looked like golden age perfection. The rumors started while he was away. Lana Turner, other actresses, the studio boss, Daryl Zanuck, allegedly meddling, pushing Power toward younger co-stars, treating marriage like another contract to be managed or broken. When Power returned from service, the marriage was already wounded. Annabella tried to save it. She stayed through the separations, through the attempts to reconcile, through the gossip columns that turned her private heartbreak into public entertainment. She stayed because she loved him, because she believed war and temptation were obstacles they could overcome, because walking away meant admitting defeat. But some marriages can't be saved by wanting them to work. Power's heart had moved on, caught in the orbit of new love and old Hollywood scandals. In 1948, Annabella finally accepted what she'd known for years. She couldn't compete with the studio system, the temptations of fame, or the simple fact that he'd stopped choosing her. The divorce was quiet, dignified, the kind of ending that doesn't make headlines but breaks hearts anyway. Annabella returned to France, continued her career, built a life that didn't depend on being Mrs. Tyrone Power. She'd stayed as long as love asked her to. And when love stopped asking, she gave herself permission to leave. In Hollywood's golden cage, that was its own kind of freedom. Eleanor Powell and Glenn Ford, a dancer's grace under fire. Eleanor Powell could tap dance faster than any man in Hollywood, but she couldn't outrun her husband's infidelities. She was MGM's greatest dancer, famous for routines that defied gravity and gender. When she married Glenn Ford in 1943, the studio machine packaged them as another perfect pair. They had a son, Peter. They had the image. They had everything except fidelity. Ford's affairs were serial, compulsive. Rita Hayworth was the most famous, but there were others, co-stars, aspiring actresses, women whose names never made the papers. His own son would later document the betrayals in interviews and biographies, pulling back the curtain on his father's inability to stay faithful. Eleanor stayed for years. She raised Peter, maintained her career, kept up the Hollywood power couple image even as the marriage crumbled behind closed doors. She stayed because of her son, because of her faith, because she kept hoping Glenn would change. because she kept hoping Glenn would change. She stayed because leaving meant admitting failure, and Eleanor Powell had never failed at anything in her life. But there's a difference between losing and choosing to stop fighting a battle you can't win. In 1959, 16 years after saying "I do," Eleanor Powell chose peace over partnership. The divorce freed her to focus on what had always been hers alone: her art, her son, her self-respect. She never spoke bitterly about Glenn. She simply moved forward, proof that Hollywood loyalty isn't always about staying. Sometimes it's about knowing when to dance off stage. Eleanor Powell kept her family steady until she decided she deserved a different kind of future. And then, with the same grace she'd shown in 1,000 routines, she let go. Elsa Lanchester and Charles Laughton, an unconventional marriage. They wrote their own rules and kept their promises, just not the promises the world expected. Elsa Lanchester and Charles Laughton married in 1929 and stayed together for 33 years, until his death in 1962. But theirs was never a conventional Hollywood marriage. Lanchester later wrote about it with disarming honesty in her memoirs: Laughton's sexuality, the conflicts, the arrangement that let them both survive in an industry that demanded heterosexual perfection. The studio system had no space for truth. So they built their own space, a marriage based on deep friendship, shared art, and mutual dependence rather than traditional romance. There were tensions. There was pain. There were moments when the arrangement strained under the weight of secrecy and silence. But they stayed. Not because they had to, not because breaking up was impossible. They stayed because they'd chosen each other as partners in a larger sense: creative collaborators, intellectual companions, fellow survivors of Hollywood's golden cage. Laughton's obsessive commitment to his craft matched Lanchester's fierce independence. They gave each other room to breathe while maintaining the facade the studios required. Their marriage was a rebellion disguised as tradition, a quiet refusal to let Hollywood define what love had to look like. When Laughton died, Lanchester wrote about him with tenderness and honesty, refusing to sanitize or mythologize. She'd stayed with him through complications that would have destroyed a more conventional couple. She'd stayed because companionship mattered more than convention. In a town that manufactured perfect love stories, Elsa Lanchester and Charles Laughton wrote their own ending. It wasn't the ending Hollywood wanted to sell, but it was real, complicated, and entirely theirs. Hollywood taught us that love was forever, as long as the cameras were rolling. But these women lived the truth. They faced betrayal with silence, grace, and a kind of strength that has no headlines. Some stayed out of love, believing marriage was a promise worth keeping even when it hurt. Others stayed for their children, for their faith, for the crushing weight of public image in an era when divorce meant scandal, and scandal meant the end of everything. Still others stayed because the studios demanded it, because walking away meant losing their careers, or because they simply had nowhere else to go. But staying wasn't weakness. These women redefined what loyalty meant, turning private heartbreak into public dignity. They survived in a system designed to control them, found power in spaces where they shouldn't have had any, and taught Hollywood that strength sometimes looks like endurance. Their marriages weren't fairy tales. They were negotiations, compromises, acts of will. Some found happiness in the staying. Others found only survival. A few discovered that leaving, when it finally came, was the bravest choice of all. In an industry built on illusion, their endurance was the most real thing of all. They lived the contrast between Hollywood's glossy image and the messy truth of celebrity heartbreak. They smiled for the cameras while their hearts broke in private. They stayed in golden age marriages that looked perfect from the outside and felt impossible from within. We remember them now not as victims, but as women who made choices in circumstances where choices were limited. They turned studio pressure into personal power, transformed old Hollywood affairs into lessons about loyalty, and showed us that staying after betrayal can mean 1,000 different things. These were the wives who stayed after their husbands cheated, the forgotten queens of old Hollywood's golden cage. Their stories remind us that behind every perfect photograph was a real woman making impossible decisions, surviving with whatever tools she had, writing her own ending in a town that wanted to write it for her. They stayed. And in staying or finally leaving, they taught us that there's no single story of strength, no one way to survive heartbreak, no simple answer to the question of what loyalty demands. Their legacy isn't the scandals, it's the survival. And that's what history should remember.